Phil asked me to do a couple of things. One is to give a quick introduction to what the advisory group is. Anyone who was here this morning was touched on briefly, but also to give a small amount of my opinion on some of the cultural impact some of this new technology is having on the network engineering industry, especially for end users, so the service provider perspective. For those that don't know me, I'm Chris Luke at Comcast, but I'm also the OpenDaylight Advisory Group Chair at the moment. So, intro to the advisory group. It was formed at the start of last year with a pretty simple charter, a group of end users, vendors not allowed, whose role is to provide end user feedback to the OpenDaylight community, the technical steering committee specifically, but the community as a whole. And the idea was to give them our very technical feedback on what we think are the shortcomings or the direction that the project should take. There's a URL there, or you can just Google OpenDaylight Advisory Group. You can get the details, you can get the charter, and who's in the group at the moment, and the minutes of our previous meetings. So who are the advisory group? At the moment, we have 15 members, including one chairperson, that's me. About half of those members are from service providers. Some of us compete with each other. That's not a big deal in this context. We've got a couple of enterprise-focused people, so big banks, media, and also a couple who also support large academic networks. So we've got quite a broad set of viewpoints for people who are actively using this technology. Key to this as well is that some of our members have OpenDaylight in production or are very close to it, so they have very rich feedback on how they're using the platform. But we also have a number of people who are still working out how they're going to use it. They're quite new to the idea of SDN, or perhaps it's, and I've come across this a couple of times, people where their management has said, hey, SDN, go find out what that is. And we know how that goes. Here's a list of them. You can go get this from the webpage. Again, just go Google it. But you can see the kind of mix of people we have. We have a bunch of European operators, some Asian operators, some North American, pretty much a broad gamut of people. But what do we actually do? Which is a question we are asked a fair amount. Well, the key thing here is that it's, I hesitate to use the word passive, but we're not a, we're going to go out and change the world kind of group. Our role is very much to give advice where it's needed. So what that means is we operate a mailing list where we can have discussions, and we also host a monthly call, so WebEx, where we generally present how we're using OpenDaylight or the challenges that we have, or we usually or sometimes invite someone from the TSC to give us feedback about what's happening in the project so that we can give feedback on it. We kind of alternate between that. We don't have what we call a strong agenda. It's not like we're calling out, here's a list of all these bullet points, we have to get through this and sign off on it at the end of the meeting. That's not what we're about. It's very much an open discussion group. Most of our work is about responding to requests from the TSC, typically the chair of the TSC. And these are generally very technical requests. It's very specifics about how should this behavior manifest itself in the controller. Occasionally we end up with procedural questions like how do we talk about when does a project become mature, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but mostly it's very technical. But it's really about sharing our experiences, sharing what we think about the project, and helping make it a better project. How does it work? Well, this is a typical life cycle of a query. Commonly, the TSC chair, that will be Colin, will say, hey Chris, there's this discussion on the TSC list and I think you should weigh in on it. Maybe the advisory group wants to weigh in on it. And I'll go and read it and go, huh, okay. And I'll formulate a question around this and I'll present that to the advisory group on the advisory group mailing list. We'll then go away and discuss it. We'll all come up with our own viewpoints, our own opinions, our own input. And then after some period, either once the conversation has died down, or usually about a week, which is what we try to set, I will then summarize that discussion and present it back to wherever the question came from. Most times that's the technical steering committee's list. Sometimes it has been specific projects. This isn't a huge workload for us. These questions that we're asked don't occur often at the moment. We would like to see that go up because we would like to give input. But at the same time, we all have day jobs. It's very difficult for us to monitor all of the lists of all of the projects because there's so many of them. So we kind of look to the TSC to be our filter at the moment. Maybe that will change. So examples of past queries that we've had in no particular order. The top one was there was a discussion on the controller and the Yang tools list about how picky the parsers for Yang and netconf should be. And some of the developers would prefer to adhere strictly to the RFCs for these, and some were less confident of that. So the TSC asked if the advisory group would take a look at this, and we pretty much said, if you're going to be strict, we cannot use you, because the network is a volatile place, and things change, things don't always work, and at 3 in the morning, it doesn't conform to the RFC is not a good enough answer when things don't work. That feedback, in the end, was given by me attending a call for one of those projects and explaining our position about why the world is not perfect. And I think that helped the perception of what the challenges are that we face versus where we're trying to get to. Yes, we would like the world to be perfect, but it is not perfect. Very early in the Boron release cycle, Colin came to us and asked, can I give you a summary, the AG, a summary of what we're planning for the Boron release, and then ask the AG, can you give us feedback about anything glaring that we think is missing? And we had some points of input there, which disappeared off into TSC discussion land. But it was very, what's the word I'm looking for? It was a nice experience being involved that early in the planning cycle for end users to be able to say, what should be on the roadmap for this release? Hopefully we'll be doing that when now it's out there and we can move on to the next release. And the last one that I wanted to bring up was graduation review. This is an example of a procedural one. There was a lot of discussion in the TSC about how projects move through their life cycle, how they move from being an incubation project to a stable project, and then how is it that, what kind of stage do they have to get past before they can be considered a core project on which other things depend for a release. So we ended up with this big, long discussion. It was pages and pages and pages that I summarized to about 2 pages and presented back to the TSC. And whilst it probably did not solve the problems that they were hoping we would solve for them, it gave them a lot more viewpoint on which to base the work they were doing. And I think the key there was that we're not trying to solve the problems for the community, we're trying to give them the viewpoint of the people using the project. Other discussions we've had lots of ad hoc discussions. Most of it is around how we are using or plan to use OpenDaylight. All of those presentations are linked from the wiki page, so feel free to go peruse them. Documentation has come up a few times. Everyone knows that it is a challenge, and everyone knows that we are trying to address it. I think we are quite cognizant of that. Whilst I do not think the advisory group can fix that because of issues, we would, I think, love to be involved in helping review that documentation and give feedback so that we can then feed it back into the cycle and help improve it. We've also looked at future-looking discussions, and I noticed on the agenda there are things like P4 and OpenDaylight are being discussed this week. We were talking about this in January. TSC and Colin came up and said, should we be considering P4 as a thing we support in OpenDaylight, not knowing what that would look like? And the answer was yes. We don't know what it looks like yet either, but yes. The next one is comes up a few times, usually around summertime. The burdensome number of conferences we all seem to have and how we cannot possibly go to all of them. I think this came up because Margaret had just come back from one of the events in Europe and was just, oh my God, there's just too much stuff. I'm done. I'm not going to any more of these. We don't have a solution for that, but what we are hoping is that with things like this conference becoming part of Linux Foundation, we'll see some consolidation of that over time. Whether this is true or not, we don't know, but certainly we feel, well, I feel, that the technical value of this conference has probably etched up a significant amount this time around compared to last time. And transactional support in interfaces. A couple of the advisory group members were asking about the impact of multiple speakers trying to do the same thing at the same time on the same controller, and things that transactional support would solve. As it happens, at the last OpenDaylight Summit last year, that was one of the design session talks that came up. So we were able to give some input into that at that time. So I've whittled on about the advisory group enough. Let's talk about what some of the impact of this stuff is having in, or at least from my perspective, in networking. So culture change. The majority of network engineers, and I'm saying network engineers specifically, are not geared for software like this, inverted commas. And by that I mean open source in general to a degree, but SDN controllers specifically. A lot of this is to do with, in the last 10, 15 years, service providers have been hiring people that may not have a generalized computer science background. They're trained to be network engineers. That's all they know. So how do we get past this? We are trying to adopt newer technologies to solve problems in more efficient ways when a significant amount of our workforce isn't able to operate that software. And there's two approaches to this. We can either find some other group in the company to run the software for us, but that kind of feels like giving the crown jewels away. You know, we're network engineering. We don't want to give network engineering to some other group. So we have to come up with other approaches. And the two key ones is building some mechanism for those engineers to avoid becoming, as I say, excuse me if you're a coal miner, to avoid becoming coal miners. Is this idea that your role becomes redundant because what you are doing is no longer relevant. You have to be aware that the environment around you is changing and take every opportunity to increase the skills you have to operate in the environment that's coming. As an employer, we've taken the view that that is a very important thing for us to provide to the people that work for us. And I assume most service providers do the same. We have done internal training around programming, scripting, hacking, doing stuff on the network. We are working with universities like UPenn to craft a specialized CS Lite course for network engineers. So this is UPenn professors teaching computer science concepts. This is all about building those critical thinking skills to think like software people, but without teaching a language, because that's not what's important. What's important is thinking, how do these abstract thoughts manifest themselves in the network? And the other one is priming the intake. There are lots, if any of you have stepped into the SOSA sessions, you'll see that there are lots of aspiring graduate students presenting lots of interesting ideas. How do we take those people and hone them into employable people in the networking industry? Not people that just have these great ideas that are a bit off the wall. How do we transform those people into usable junior engineers? We do that a lot by doing outreach events. We do presentations at colleges. We do an annual throwdown competition, kind of like a hackathon, with a few North Jersey and Philadelphia area colleges every year, which is all about trying to get these people to think about the service provider perspective when they're learning these SDN concepts. This is a more of a personal gripe than anything else. In my company, there's only one me. And I don't know about you in your company, but often there's only one you as well. The difference here is that we're dealing with a whole bunch of really new stuff, which means that everybody wants a piece of the person that knows anything about it. But at the same time, the legacy network still needs care and feeding, because that's what's paying for the bread each day. And it turns out that my previous role, looking after all of the automation stuff in our network, trying to get that squared away, is quite an important part of that business. So they keep coming back and asking for direction and advice. So it's very difficult to focus on the purely new stuff and still maintain the old stuff. I suspect that is true for most people in this field. We don't hire a team of SDN-focused people necessarily to go off and do that and expect them to succeed in the existing environment. And technical change, and this is one of the ones that's close to my heart. The relationship between our network engineering groups and the OS SPSS department. So the distinction I make here is that there is a group of people who worry about order processing and billing and stuff like that. And historically, they have either had their tentacles deep into the network in places they should never have been, or they have such a clumsy interface between they and the network that it's not automation at all. And most organizations I've come across are somewhere between the two. We have this wonderful term called swivel in our process. Everything's automated, including where a person types on one keyboard and turns around and types on another keyboard. It's cut and paste with an air gap. That relationship is changing. Those groups and the vendors that they rely on are waking up to this idea that there will be an abstract interface to the network, that they don't need to worry about the inventory of the network as much as they have previously. They don't need to worry about the fact that we assign IP addresses. They don't need to track that unless they need to present it to the customer, in which case they can come ask. We don't need to worry about this synchronization of databases, which never works. The work there is about defining those abstract interfaces, and there are no standards for this, which properly represent the products that you sell. That's what the remainder of my year probably looks like, is taking the handful of services that we actively have OS SPSS systems for and working with that group to redefine what that interface looks like and how to properly encapsulate the needs of those products and services in what we do in the automation of the network. But the key for that is that if we use OpenDaylight or if we don't, they should never need to know. At the moment, they know everything we do. The problem with that is that if we ever need to change anything, we have to talk to them. And then because they rely on vendors to do stuff, we have to talk to the vendor too. And the vendor usually comes back with, that will be $9 million and we'll give you an answer in 9 months. That doesn't fly in what we're trying to do. So that was a whirlwind of everything. Oh no, I've got one more slide. Technical change, new tools to solve all problems. This one's pretty simple. My underlying message here is SDN is a tool. Find the problems that you can solve with that tool. The last few years, there's just been this hype cycle of SDN. It can solve all problems. We should migrate the entire network to SDN. That obviously hasn't transpired. People have worked out that the problems of doing that are far greater than that perhaps they had originally envisaged. But it does solve some problems, identify those problems, and work on that. In my network, what we're focusing on is the complexity in the core of the network and how can we push that to the edges, focus more on the individual services, and thereby hopefully make it more manageable. Other networks may have other problems they focus on. But for us, this is about, don't think of SDN as some revolution in replacing the whole network wholesale, because that will never fly. It is about identify the areas where it's going to add value. Now that is my last slide, which is good because I'm 8 minutes early, which means we have time for some questions, or you can go run away and have lunch.
Well, which is it? Lunch or questions?
There we go. Yeah, don't be shy.
Hello. I think the page talk about the department are reworking the relationship with OS SPSS. I like the idea, but do you give some specific case talk about that?
So I like to think that at the interface layer, we effectively have two relationships with OS SPSS. One of them is, what is the network doing as it relates to specific services deployed for specific customers? And the other one is, how do I add, modify, or delete one of those services for a specific customer? At the moment, that relationship is blurred because the OS SPSS does some of that discovery itself and does some of that deployment itself. Our current OS SPSS has network discovery. It goes out and talks to network devices. I do not like that, because if I change a network device, it means I have to talk to them and their vendor, which makes things much more difficult. If we want to change how we deploy a service, it increases the number of players involved in doing that. Similarly, with deploying a service, at the moment we have a fairly clean abstraction for how we generate network config and then get that on the network. But some of the test and turn-up mechanisms are not so clearly defined, and there's half a dozen of those. This is not a clean way of interfacing the network service with the rest of the business. Does that answer the question?
So you talked about network engineers getting trained on learning some of the extract models or kind of how software developers think. Have you thought about, ONF has a certification program that is training network engineers. What's your thought about that? You left.
Maybe over a beer I'll give you my opinion of certification. Because I think that's part of the problem, is certification narrowly focuses what you are capable of doing. What I'm trying to do is give people the tools to think so they can be applied to any problem, not just what we're trying to do here. I had this argument a while ago with some friends on my old college professor's list on Facebook about they were disappointed in the current comp sci course. Bear in mind, I took this same course 20 years ago. And how it's not properly preparing students for the networking industry because kids are coming out of middle school now with the ability to tell the difference between a router and a switch. And all the history of computing stuff should be stripped out, and it's pointless. We should all be preparing for vendor certification. And they just hit so many of my buttons in one go that I had this huge rant, but the crux was a degree is not meant to teach you how to do something on a Cisco device. It's meant to teach you how to think and then work out how to do something on any device. And that's the difference. My fear is that anything that is labeled training focuses on a specific set of problems. I'm trying to build a workforce of people that are not conveyor belt focused. They can solve problems as they arise, not follow a script. But that's my personal opinion.
Okay, Chris, so how much of SDN do you think is about solving orchestration problems as opposed to control problems?
Tricky questions. So the mantra is that SDN is about disaggregating control plane from data plane. And certainly, yes, that is useful to a degree, but if you break open the box of most of the big vendors' devices, they've been doing that for years. It just happens to be in the same box. But there's two logical components there, the data plane and the control plane. Breaking that out, in theory, gives you more flexibility, and that's some of the stuff that OpenFlow was trying to do. But the more you do that, the more you realize that you need to have a bigger picture view of what's going on, and the more you dig into that, and at least this has been my experience, you realize that there are some mechanisms for doing that, controllers from different groups, from different vendors, that are focused on solving a specific set of problems, but no one solves all of the problems. If you start looking at things like how do I then do NFV, that's a completely different domain of problems to solve. So then again, you need something on top of that to solve that. Some of this comes back to the OS SPSS, but I see the orchestration role becomes it's not so much how do I manage all the pieces, that's my front door for anybody to get anything done in the network. It doesn't necessarily need to have like an omnipresent knowledge of everything that's going on, but all it needs to be able to do is say, this is one of these, and I need to know how to get to those things to make it happen. So to answer your question, how much? The answer is yes. It's both. And you may find that there are different people in your organization that focus on those two things because they're not the same problem, but they're equally important.
Hello. What is the advisory group's view on carrier-grade features like security, cluster, HA, or backup restore, in-service upgrade? I mean, do you provide importance and push for those features?
So we did have a long discussion about this term carrier grade, and our general consensus was it's bullshit because it means different things to different people. You need to identify those high availability features that are important to you. Some organizations are adopting the elastic model for how they manage their network. That means they don't worry about an individual controller having a particularly high uptime. They worry about how quick it is to rebuild it, for example. It's a very different approach to the same problem. But the point there is that the carrier grade features aren't then built into the controller, they're built into whatever's managing its environment. So there's no clear answer to that. That said, we do need to focus on having things that are manageable, and their uptime is obviously important, and having a degree of confidence that they do the job when you ask them to do it. And we do place, in the advisory group, we have raised that several times with the TSC. And generally, we are comfortable that they are working towards satisfying what we would hope the controller will be able to do.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm one of those grad students who you talked about who, who have a lot of cool ideas. I have a couple of papers on the subject, but don't know how to turn it into an actual working networking project. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if there are any, concrete set of resources that are out there, either from your group or from any other group, where I can not necessarily follow, go through a set of steps to turn it into a product, but get to learn more about how things need to be put together rather than what's available out there and you will figure out how it goes where.
I don't think I have a good answer to that. Learning how to turn things into a product, as you say, and how to make them useful to the network is a very tricky and I think almost intangible problem. It's definitely something you learn from experience. So possibly you need to make a few mistakes first, and then you work out what's right. But no, feel free to catch me later, and we can dig into that, because I think that's definitely an over a beer kind of conversation.
Okay. That concludes this session. Thank you very, very much, Chris.
Cool. Phil asked me to do a couple of things. One is to give a quick introduction to what the advisory group is. Anyone who was here this morning was touched on briefly. But also to give a small amount of my opinion on some of the cultural impact some of this new technology is having on the network engineering industry, especially for end users, so the service provider's perspective. For those that don't know me, I'm Chris Luke at Comcast, but I'm also the OpenDaylight Advisory Group Chair at the moment. So, intro to the advisory group. It was formed at the start of last year with a pretty simple charter, a group of end users, vendors not allowed, whose role is to provide end user feedback to the OpenDaylight community, the technical steering committee specifically, but the community as a whole. And the idea was to give them our very technical, we operate a mailing list where we can have discussions, and we also host a monthly call, it's a WebEx, where we generally present how we're using OpenDaylight or the challenges that we have, or we usually or sometimes invite someone from the TSC to give us feedback about what's happening in the project so that we can give feedback on it. We kind of alternate between that. We don't have what we call a strong agenda. It's not like we're calling, here's a list of all these bullet points, we have to get through this and sign off on it at the end of the meeting. That's not what we're about. It's very much an open discussion group. Most of our work is about responding to requests from the TSC, typically the chair of the TSC. And these are generally very technical requests. It's very specifics about how should this behavior manifest itself in the controller. Occasionally we end up with using the platform, but we also have a number of people who are still working out how they're going to use it. They're quite new to the idea of SDN, or perhaps it's, and I've come across this a couple of times, people where their management has said, hey, SDN, go find out what that is. And we know how that goes. Here's a list of them. You can go get this from the webpage. Again, just go Google it. But you can see the kind of mix of people we have. We have a bunch of European operators, some Asian operators, some North American, pretty much a broad gamut of people. But what do we actually do? Which is a question we are asked a fair amount. Well, the key thing here is that I hesitate to use the word passive, but we're not we're going to go out and change the world kind of group. Our role is very much to give advice where it's needed. So what that means is feedback on what we think are the shortcomings or the direction that the project should take. There's a URL there, or you can just Google OpenDaylight Advisory Group. You can get the details, you can get the charter, and who's in the group at the moment, and the minutes of our previous meetings. So who are the advisory group? At the moment, we have 15 members, including one chairperson, that's me. About half of those members are from service providers. Some of us compete with each other. That's not a big deal in this context. We've got a couple of enterprise-focused people, so big banks, media, and also a couple who also support large academic networks. So we've got quite a broad set of viewpoints for people who are actively using this technology. Key to this as well is that some of our members have OpenDaylight in production or are very close to it. So they have very rich feedback on how they procedural questions, like how do we talk about when does a project become mature, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But mostly it's very technical. But it's really about sharing our experiences, sharing what we think about the project, and helping make it a better project. How does it work? Well, this is a typical life cycle of a query. Commonly, the TSC chair, that will be Colin, will say, hey Chris, there's this discussion on the TSC list and I think you should weigh in on it. Maybe the advisory group wants to weigh in on it. And I'll go and read it and go, huh, okay. And I'll formulate a question around this and I'll present that to the advisory group on the advisory group mailing list. We'll then go away and discuss it. We'll all come up with our own viewpoints, our own opinions, our own input. And then after some period, either once the conversation has died down, or usually about a week, which is what we try to set, I will then summarize that discussion and present it back